they play within this very complex, very hierarchical system. And there can be even 60,000 individuals in a single hive. And this is very, very different from the majority of wild bees that we have, especially in North America. But in general, this is sort of the height of socialization within the insect world is shown by the European honeybee. And so they are very different from native North American bees specifically for that reason as well. They look quite a bit different as well, as we'll talk about, than most of our native bees here in North America. You won't really see any other bee that has this kind of beautiful golden orange. It can range in color, but orangish to brownish with some striping. There's really no other bee that looks like that. So if you're seeing a bee that looks like this, gonna be the honeybee. So this image from Pollinator Partnership, which is a great website, it just kind of shows the wide range of pollinator diversity that does exist in the world across the globe. We won't see, actually, no, we would see all of these within no, not the rodents. But so there are pollinators that are rodents in parts of the tropics. We do have these pollinator bat species in the southwestern United States, but not really anywhere else in the United States, except maybe, I guess, Hawaii, probably. But certainly in the tropics and in Asia and Africa, these pollinating bat species are super important. They pollinate agave, bananas, and a lot of very important crops as well. There are night flying moths and hawk moths that pollinate plants. There are wasps and bees by day and hummingbirds by day as well. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of pollinators beyond the European honeybee. And so wild bees, there are over 20,000 described species globally. And in North America, there are about 4,000 species known. And we still really only think that we know about kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's out there in actuality. Just haven't really had the human power to go and look in places like Africa and Asia. We know a lot about what's going on in North America because there are great, academic institutions and places where people study these things, but there's still a lot to be known out there. So bees are unique in terms of pollinating because they are especially well adapted to pollinating. As you can see in this bee right here, this bee is just absolutely covered with these really dense, fine hairs that are covered in pollen, as you can see, all the way up to its face. And bees have a very special kind of hair, actually. It's a branched hair, so it's like one single hair with many little branches coming off of it. And bees are unique. That's one of the ways that we taxonomically identify bees, because there's many bees that look a lot like a wasp and vice versa, because bees are very, very closely related to wasps, but they're different. And another unique thing about bees is that they rely completely on flowers for all of their life stages. So from larva all the way up to adult, they only consume, pollen, nectar, or occasionally floral oils. Some bees consume the oils that come from flowers, but they're only eating things that come from flowers. Versus if you think of other pollinators, something like a butterfly, for instance, a lot of times the caterpillar, the larval stage, consumes the leaves of a plant, right? And as an adult, they consume and they pollinate flowers. But for bees, it's all the life stages that they're totally reliant on the flowers. So that makes these insects especially well adapted to collecting these what we call floral resources. So the food that they get from the flowers, the pollen and the nectar. They evolved specifically to be able to do that. So bees, wild bees have a wide range of nesting habits. from, you know, the small carpenter bees that will drill within the soft pith of woody stems, to bumblebees, which have this kind of mess of a system. They're termed cavity nesters, but that sometimes can be found in somewhat open looking areas like a hay bale. Oftentimes people who have barns will find them in their hay nesting. And there are leaf cutter bees that also are cavity nesters, so they go into woody wood structures. They're well adapted to urban environments, a lot of them, because they can find like old fences and wooden porches and all kinds of wooden structures to nest in. But actually the majority, around 75% of all bees, are ground nesters. So something like what you would think of a ground nesting wasp or an ant even. They're very closely related to bees, and it looks very similar. They just, you know, drill down and they dig down into the soil, and they build their nest there. So pollinators come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. You know, there's hummingbirds down in Alabama. You'd have those as well. The butterflies, the bats, and even wasps are pollinators, but they do share one thing in common, and that would be the fact that they, at some point in their life stage, are using flowers for their food source. So flowers, for the most part, provide pollen and nectar. Pollen is sort of the protein source that the bees and other pollinators will use, and nectar has carbohydrate mostly, as well as water, and a lot of important vitamins and minerals as well. And so these pollinators become covered with these various resources and move them around because they're well adapted to collecting those things. So just as some little bit of background information as well, pollination itself is just simply the process of transferring the pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, which is called the stigma. That enables fertilization of the plant to occur and for reproduction to occur. So in plants, this can look very different. This is what's called a hermaphroditic flower, where both the male and female structures are found within the same flower. But some plants, like this one over here that many of you are probably familiar with, the squash, they have a female flower and a separate male flower. It's called a monoecious plant. And the female is very distinct because it has this ovary here that will eventually develop into the squash. And so in the case of the squash and other cucurbits, pollination is absolutely necessary to occur by an animal, because otherwise this pollen from the male part of the male flower couldn't get to the female flower any other way. Whereas plants that are hermaphroditic like this, they have this kind of backup system in case there are no pollinators around. Wind and various movements will enable that pollen to fall onto the female stigma and eventually travel down into the ovary and fertilize that flower. So just as an example here, this is a watermelon flower. This is the male flower, and this is the beautiful two-spotted longhorn bee, which you can see in Auburn in your gardens. I saw them many times when I was there. It will visit the male flower. And of course, it's not like the bee is specifically thinking, I gotta pollinate this plant. It's just that they're trying to get food for itself, you know, and this is a female, she's going to collect the pollen on her hind legs. In the case of this species, she has these incredibly dense, you know, furry hind legs. And she's going to gather a bunch of pollen, and she's going to bring that back to her nest. And she's just a single mom. She's not like a honeybee. She doesn't have a queen to provide for. She doesn't have anyone else helping her. So she's just bringing back all of that pollen back to her single little nest in the ground, and she will feed her developing larvae. with that pollen. And then so eventually, as she's moving along, she's visiting other flowers of the same type usually. And so she would eventually come along to a female flower. And as you can see, this is the female flower because you've got the ovary of the plant that's going to develop into the watermelon. And eventually, if that is successful, if there's usually 1 to 2 visits for watermelon for this particular species, because it is so good at depositing a lot of pollen. For a honeybee, it takes a few more times to visit the watermelon flower in order for that fertilization to occur, actually. So why do pollinators matter? They are what are called keystone species. So they are really important to natural ecosystems because of their role that they play. About 88%, so the vast majority of all flowering plants rely on, sorry, I misspelled that, rely on pollinators to reproduce. So of course, with these flowering plants, which form a lot of times kind of the backbone of a lot of ecosystems, they eventually produce seeds and fruits and berries and all kinds of things that you can think of, birds and rodents and all kinds of creatures consume those types of fruits and seeds. And then, of course, the higher level predators consume those lower level herbivores and omnivores. And so without that kind of backbone, these systems would fall apart. And not only do they provide these seeds and fruits and nuts for creatures as large as, black bears even, they also are a really important food source in and of themselves. Many birds, as I'm sure many of you know, most birds actually rely on insects as a food source at some point in their life stage, whether that's as a young chick or as an adult. They consume insects, enormously. So even just in and of themselves, they're a really important food source. And this is a really, I think, just cool video that I took in a wetland in Ohio during my master's research. And this is a bumblebee pollinating a monkey flower plant, which is a native plant to this wetland. And it's just a really important part of this ecosystem that you see here in its role of pollinating this plant, which will then be able to spread its seed and move around. And then this plant will also serve as a food source for other creatures within that wetland. So in terms of human beings, more than a third of the total food supply comes from animal pollinated plants, and insect pollinators contribute to 75% of the leading food crop production. So some plants, for example, strawberries, they don't necessarily have to have a pollinator to enable pollination to occur. Like I said, they're hermaphroditic, so they can have that backup system in case a pollinator is not around. They can still produce fruit. However, they tend to have much higher yields and much better tasting fruit and much more sugar content to that fruit, and even a higher shelf life to that fruit, which are all great things for the farmer as well as the consumer, if that pollination occurs from an animal pollinator. So that's important to keep in mind as well. As well as the fact that if as you look at these images on the screen here, most of us, this is kind of the color and the variety and the flavor that's within our diet. If you think of your diet without these types of foods, it would probably be pretty bland, pretty, not nutritious. These plants provide a lot of the micronutrients that we rely on, a lot of the vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E. So these critical, what we call micronutrients, vitamins and minerals that help us to fight disease, fight cancer, and just really keep ourselves healthy. So without these plants, we would definitely, not be very well off. And in addition, the majority of crop pollination at a global scale is actually delivered by wild pollinators. So again, most of us think of immediately of the honeybee, but in terms of the world. These areas in pink are where the wild insects, including wild bees, are doing all of the pollination of these crops. So, you know, definitely honeybees are still very, very important, still valuable, and need research done on them and all of that. But in terms of what the wild insects are doing, it can't really be overstated. And this study here looked at, I think, 35 plants that are important for crops worldwide, ranging from coffee to blueberry to kiwi to cherry. And so, and again, in the pink is where the wild insects are contributing, which is much higher than the honeybees in the case of almost all of these crops here. In addition, as you probably are aware, the honeybees are facing huge declines, especially in North America, and receive a lot of media attention for that. From 1947 to 2005, there were about 59% losses of honeybees. From 2010 to 2020, this is the most recent report that actually Selena Bruckner at Auburn is kind of the lead author on this, which is really cool, at Auburn Bee Lab. But we see in general that around 40% of colonies are lost every single year since about 2010, and 2019 was another year. You can see here is where that annual loss bar is, and it's actually over 40% loss for that year. So if you think about that number, I mean, that's almost half of all the colonies that are being lost to these beekeepers every single year since a couple of decades now. So that makes it very hard for beekeepers to have a livelihood, and very, very influential in the agricultural sector as well. So, you know, part of this is just the things that we subject these honeybees to in the agricultural industry that we have today, where we put them on these big semis and we truck them from somewhere like where I am in Florida all the way out to California every single year. This is an almond orchard in California. There's almost 1 million acres of almond orchards in California. And most of the United States hives actually get transported out to California to perform the largest pollination event on Earth. And that is the almond pollination every single February in California. And so these conditions that we put these insects under is a large reason for their decline. When you put an insect in a box, then you put it on a truck and cover it up. Then you transport it a few thousand miles out to California. Then you plop it down in a field where it only has one plant to forage from. And these are insects that are evolved to forage off of many different plants, many different types of pollen, but they only have this one type of plant to feed from. This is their only option because, like I said, there's literally almost 1 million acres of only almond. Then we spray these plants with about, you know, how many different pesticides and fungicides and things to try to keep them from getting eaten by pests, and that these honeybees are, of course, exposed to. And we also expose, if for instance, these hives here are from Florida, and these hives next door are from Wisconsin, and these ones are from North Dakota, well, now we've just exposed all these bees from Florida to all the disease and problems that the bees in Wisconsin have, and the ones from North Dakota. So then we wonder why these honeybees are facing so many issues. You know, I don't think it really takes a rocket scientist or a wildlife biologist to figure that one out. There's just so many stressors, so many disease transfers happening. And in addition to that, we've introduced the varroa mite as of the late 80s into the United States, which has just introduced a whole other can of worms. So in summary, I think it's really important to realize that also, even if the honeybees weren't facing any problems which they are, relying on just one species to pollinate a third of the world's food supply is highly risky. Yeah, so I'll just end it with that. But in terms of the pollinators that you all could possibly see in your gardens, I did want to touch on this. So there's a wide variety. These are just a couple examples, and I'm going to go through a few of these in more detail. In terms of the bumblebees, the lovely, charismatic, you know, cuddly, fuzzy bumblebees, the teddy bears of the pollinator world. They are in the genus Bombus in the family Apidae, and they are cavity nesters, as I said earlier. So they often will find rodent holes too to nest in, old rodent holes, which is interesting. Two species that you all could see, I should say y'all could see, would be the American bumblebee or the Southern Plains bumblebee. These are actually both considered by the IUCN to be vulnerable or endangered. So here in the Southeast, we have to be keeping a really close eye on these two species because their range has declined enormously in the past decade or so. But we do see them still fairly commonly in the southeastern United States. And I did see these two species in the Auburn Community Garden. And you can go to bumblebeewatch.org and you can actually participate as a citizen scientist and contribute photographs to the bumblebeewatch.org, which is headed up by a few professors at, I believe, the University of Toronto. And they're doing great work, and they're able to track the geographic ranges of these species thanks to people who are taking photographs of them. So that would be a really great thing if you want to contribute to helping understand these, especially these two species. We really need more information on where these are occurring frequently. There are a couple of really great guides that I can recommend if you want to help you identify them. But that bumblebeewatch.org will help you identify them as well. Then there's the sweat bees, which is a huge group of insects, thousands of species within this, containing the genera Lacewglossum, Halictus, Nomia. They're in the family Halictidae, which again is a really diverse group of insects, group of bees. They nest in the ground. They range from sort of a plain Jane looking metallic gray bee to this bright, beautiful metallic emerald green color. They tend to be fairly small, these sweat bees. They can sometimes have the striping on them, it just depends. But these are very, very, very common. And you will definitely have, especially this bee right here in your garden somewhere. And they can be, like I said, quite small and sort of inconspicuous, but they're really important. They're highly common. If you're looking to have help in identifying your bees, or you want to look up some pictures of bees that insects in general that you think you might have in your garden, you can go to bugguide.net. I highly recommend that. I use it all the time, and there are like world experts on there in terms of identifying insects that can help you if you have a pretty decent photograph. The leafcutter bees, one of my personal favorites. This is the genus Megachile in the family Megachilidae. They're cavity nesters. They have this adorable habit where they use their mandibles, so their jaws, to cut out these sort of perfect circular cutouts from leaves. Then they tuck the leaf under their little body and they fly away with it, and that's what they use to line the nest that they go into. They, like I said earlier, they go into wooden structures like tree cavities, or in urban areas in like old fences and decks and things like that. And they line each individual cell of their nest with this little piece of leaf. And so when you look inside, crack open one of these nests, it looks something like this. They have a variety of different kind of, look to them, but oftentimes they will have this white striping on a black body. One of the most distinguishable things about the leafcutter bees is that they have all of their really important pollen collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen, so like on their belly, you could think of it. And so a lot of times what you'll see is something like this in this picture on the bottom right, where the underside of the abdomen is like a bright orange or yellow because of all the pollen that is underneath their abdomen. And you can see that in this picture too on the upper right, where it's sort of on the outside of her abdomen, but that's really kind of pollen overflowing from the underside of her abdomen. Mason bees are another one that you could see in early spring in Auburn. This is the genus Osmia and the family Megachilidae as well, and these are also cavity nesters. They will nest in these tubes, in these bee homes. This is what will nest, as well as sometimes the leaf cutting bees, and as well as a lot of wasps and other creatures will nest in these bee hotels that people will sometimes put in their gardens. If you're lucky, you might get some mason bees in there, and they use mud to actually help line their nest cells. They can range from this really beautiful, like dark metallic blue to like a metallic green color. Unfortunately, there has been a couple of introduced species from Asia, purposefully introduced into the United States, similar to the European honeybee, but they have led to the decline of a lot of the native mason bees in our area. Longhorn bees are another one that you could commonly see in summer and fall even. This is the genus Melisodes in the family Avidae, along with the bumblebees and honeybees. These are ground nesters, so they would nest in the ground like the ants and things that we're familiar with. The two-spotted longhorn bee, again, is really common in the southeast, and it's all black, except for on the very tip of its abdomen, it's got these two white spots, usually, unless it's kind of worn away because she's an old female. This is the female, and then the male looks like this. And the reason they're called longhorn bees is because the males will have these super long antennae. And the common longhorn bee is also a very common bee that you would see in your garden in the southeast. And it's got a very different look to it, but once you've seen a few of these a bunch of times, it does become easier. So what can we all do to help pollinators? This is what I'll just touch on briefly here as we wrap up. The number one thing would be to try to provide food, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, probably, but some tips in terms of being really good at providing food for pollinators would be to try to have a long flowering period. So having plants that flower from early spring all the way into the fall with things like goldenrod and things that will flower late into the fall. As well as planting a diversity of plant families. Of course, these plants here, like the Asteraceae, the cone flowers and the sunflowers and things like that, will draw in a wide variety, and they're great. You know, if that's all you have, that's still wonderful. But if we can provide more diversity in other plant families, and you can ask your nurseries about this if you have questions. But that would enable for some of these bees are actually specialists, so they only visit a certain family of plant or certain species of plant. And these are the ones that are really vulnerable to habitat loss because people don't always plant these sort of rare species or things that are a little bit maybe harder to find or a little bit harder to grow even than sunflowers or something that's really simple. Always try to plant native plants if you can. Of course, in a vegetable garden, this is something different, and I fully endorse planting vegetables and fruits and all of that as well. But when we can also provide some native plants for bees and the other pollinators, that is going to help them planting herbs and things like that and letting them flower, letting some of them maybe go to flower and go to seed, and even harvesting the seeds and planting them next year is a really great thing to do. A lot of bees really like herbs, flowers. And then as well as buying from native plant nurseries and seed companies when possible, just because a lot of the big box stores, they are using plants that are sort of grown for a lot of the other parts of the country that are not having the same climate as the Southeast, so they may not be super well adapted to the warmer climate of the Southeast, as well as the fact that there's very little regulation on what can be sprayed on these plants in big box stores. So it's really good to be able to go to a native plant nursery, support the local businesses, the small businesses that can tell you if this thing has been sprayed by a pesticide. Another way would be to provide habitat by leaving areas of the garden wild. I know community gardens are really great at this, whether they mean to or not, but you know, leaving a place wild looking, I think there really needs to be some type of a paradigm shift from these super manicured, super Victorian style gardens to leaving some areas wild, because there is a huge benefit that we can provide as homeowners, as gardeners, in leaving some areas of our gardens and our yards wild, not just for pollinators, but also songbirds and reptiles and all kinds of creatures. You can also leave things like dead stems and twigs and woody material. And I know, again, this can look a little bit, you know, not aesthetic, but you could even, you know, hypothetically remove some of them and just put them in another area of your yard that maybe isn't as visible to passing neighbors or whomever, but leaving them out there so that these cavity nesting bees, for instance, have somewhere to nest. And then leaving bare soil patches. Bees will nest in dry, sun-exposed soil like this, so that's another important thing. And then avoiding pesticides. I know this is probably common sense, but trying to use other methods of pest management when at all possible, doing a little bit of research. I talk about a story that I just had on my Instagram page. If you're on Instagram, you can see that story I had where I personally have a ton of these leaf leaf rolling caterpillars, which turns into a beautiful skipper butterfly. But I didn't realize that bush beans can actually tolerate 30% defoliation, damage to the leaves before it actually starts to affect their yields. So then I realized I really didn't have any problem at all, because I was seeing all this damage on my bean leaves, but then I started to think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get any beans. But then I looked at the flowers, they looked great, looked at the beans they were producing. So in the end, I really didn't have a problem. When you absolutely need to, you can use things like neem oil, other organic pesticides, but again, trying to spray only in the late evening when pollinators are not going to be active is preferable. And there are a couple of really great websites for learning more about pesticides. Even organic pesticides, some of them can still be very toxic to bees, even neem oil, which is why I recommend spraying it in the late evening. If you go to beyondpesticides.org or xerces.org, they have a plethora of wonderful resources for you, and you can help maybe even educate other people that you know about these topics. And the last thing I'll just touch on is to really try to not transport insects outside of their native range. I know there's been a lot of encouragement, even within the media, even within certain institutions to, for instance, order mason bees in the mail, and that would help save the bees. And in reality, anytime we're ordering insects and transporting them great distances to a new area, we just increase the probability that we could spread disease into these new areas, into the native population of these insects. And unfortunately, that's what we've really seen. It's exemplified by the bumblebee populations as well as these mason bees that I kind of touched on. So really, anything we can do to support the wild populations that are in our areas, in our local areas, bringing in insects like honeybees. I'm not against beekeeping by any means, but it is a species that spreads disease to the wild insect populations. And keeping honeybees, thinking that is going to help save the bees is something akin to saying or thinking that keeping chickens in your backyard is going to help with the wild songbird populations. So they're totally different species. They're totally different. So that's just something something to keep in mind. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, or if you have further deeper questions, you can feel free to email me. I'd be happy to write to you. You can also find me on Instagram at A Peek into Pollinators, or read my blog. And then these other websites are kind of ones I touched on, or just other ones that I know are really great. So yeah, thank you all so much for being here today again.